The air inside the obsidian room felt heavy, thick with the scent of roasted truffles, aged bourbon, and the stifling, unspoken rules of high society. It was one of those hyper-exclusive establishments nestled on the top floor of a sleek skyscraper overlooking the city skyline, a place where the glass windows were tinted to keep the world out, and the linen tablecloths were woven from Egyptian cotton so dense it muffled the sound of dropped silver. I sat near the edge of our circular table, my fingers resting lightly against the smooth porcelain of my water glass. My name is Beatrice Vance. I am 61 years old. I am a matriarch, a retired university professor of literature, a widow, and for a very long time, I was a woman who believed that discretion was the highest virtue. I was raised in a generation where women were taught to swallow their anger, to transform their grievances into polite smiles, and to ensure that family harmony was preserved at all costs. But that night, beneath the soft, amber glow of the custom-made chandeliers, something inside my soul didn't just bend, it shattered into pieces that could never be glued back together. The occasion was supposed to be a joyous milestone, the 4th birthday of my grandson, Leo. It was my daughter, Clara, who had organized the dinner. She had spent weeks coordinating the schedules, calling the restaurant's concierge to secure the most prestigious table, and carefully curating a menu that would satisfy the incredibly demanding tastes of her husband, Vance, and his father, Harrison Sterling. Clara had pleaded with me to wear something elegant, something that would blend seamlessly into the old-money aesthetic that the Sterling family wore like armor. I had complied, stepping out of my comfort zone to wear a deep emerald velvet gown, a dress my late husband, Arthur, had bought for me during our last trip to Vienna. In my silk clutch, I carried a vintage silver pocket watch that had belonged to my grandmother. It didn't tick anymore, its internal gears frozen in time, but it was my anchor. It was a tangible reminder of the long line of women I came from, women who had endured cold marriages, demanding households, and the quiet, crushing weight of expectations without ever raising their voices. I had arrived at the Obsidian Room 20 minutes early. Punctuality is a habit I could never break. It was my way of maintaining control in an unpredictable world. The restaurant was nearly empty when I was seated, the waitstaff moving like well-trained shadows across the plush charcoal carpets. I watched the rain begin to streak against the massive panoramic windows, distorting the city lights below into bleeding smears of yellow and neon blue. 10 minutes later, Clara walked through the glass double doors, her arm tightly looped through Vance's. The moment my eyes fell upon her face, a cold knot formed in the pit of my stomach. To anyone else, Clara looked breathtaking. She was a brilliant woman, a former senior researcher in biochemistry who had graduated at the top of her class, though she had placed her career on a temporary hiatus after Leo was born. She was wearing a high-collared, long-sleeved satin blouse, despite the oppressive, humid heat of late spring. She was smiling, a bright, dazzling smile that flashed perfectly for the restaurant's hostess, but as a mother, I saw right through it. It was a cosmetic smile. It was the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes, which were wide, hypervigilant, and rimmed with a faint, telltale puffiness that no amount of expensive concealer could fully mask. Her lips were dry, and I noticed the subtle, rhythmic twitching of her jawline, a nervous tic she only developed when she was under immense psychological duress. Grandma Beatrice, Vance greeted me as they approached the table. His voice was smooth, carrying that projection of wealthy refinement that had captivated my daughter 4 years ago. He was a successful hedge fund manager, a handsome man with sharp, symmetrical features and hair that was immaculately styled. He gave me a brief, perfunctory nod, his touch entirely devoid of warmth. "You're early, as usual." "Punctuality is a sign of respect for other people's time, Vance," I replied quietly, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. Clara leaned down to kiss my cheek. Her skin felt ice-cold against mine, and I could feel the erratic, rapid thumping of her pulse against her throat. "Mom, thank you for coming," she whispered, her voice carrying a fragile, breathless quality. "Everything has to go perfectly tonight. Harrison is taking time out of his merger meetings to be here." "Where is the birthday boy?" I asked, looking behind them for my grandson. "Oh, Leo is at home with a premium agency nanny," Vance answered smoothly, pulling out a chair for Clara with a sharp, robotic movement. The obsidian room isn't an environment for a 4-year-old. He would be a distraction. This dinner is about celebrating the milestone of our family unit, not chasing a toddler under tables. I felt a flash of indignation but kept my lips pressed together. A birthday dinner for a child, without the child present. It was entirely emblematic of the Sterling philosophy, appearance over substance, prestige over genuine affection. Before I could comment, Harrison Sterling arrived. The patriarch of the Sterling family moved with an aggressive aura of entitlement that demanded the attention of the entire room. He was a broad-shouldered man in his late 60s, wearing a tailored charcoal suit that cost more than my monthly retirement pension. His voice was a deep, gravelly baritone that always sounded as though he were issuing an ultimatum to a boardroom. Behind him walked his wife, Evelyn, a woman who had spent 35 years shrinking herself to fit into his shadow. She was dressed in an expensive, shapeless gray dress, her head bowed, her gaze fixed entirely on the floor 2 steps ahead of her husband's polished leather Oxfords. By the end of this story, I'm also going to share something special with those of you who stick around to the end, something that can help you in your personal life. But first, let's get back to Vance. Beatrice, Harrison boomed, pulling out his own chair without waiting for the staff. He didn't bother to greet Clara or Evelyn. He immediately signaled the sommelier with a demanding snap of his fingers. Bring us a bottle of the 82 Bordeaux. And make sure it's decanted properly this time. The last time I was here, the service was abysmal. We sat down, the atmosphere instantly shifting from a tense family gathering to a high-stakes court where Harrison was the sole judge and executioner. The menus were distributed, and the dinner began with a veneer of forced, superficial conversation. Harrison spoke at length about his real estate acquisitions, while Vance nodded eagerly, chiming in with financial metrics to prove his worth to his father. Evelyn remained entirely mute, cutting her artisanal bread into minuscule pieces, moving them around her plate like a robot operating on a failing battery. Clara sat directly across from me, her posture so rigid she looked as though she were made of porcelain. I watched her closely, observing the way her eyes darted toward Vance every time she took a sip of water, as if she were constantly measuring the atmospheric pressure of his mood. And then, the first hairline fracture in the evening's facade appeared. It was an incident so profoundly trivial, so utterly insignificant, that in a normal family, it wouldn't have even registered as a footnote. The waiter arrived to take our entree orders. Clara, looking flustered by the rapid-fire French terminology on the menu, pointed to a seafood dish and requested a glass of crisp, chilled Riesling. Vance's hand stopped mid-air as he was swirling his water. He slowly turned his head to look at my daughter, his expression shifting into a mask of cold, dangerous condescension. The silence that fell over our table was sudden, cutting through the ambient jazz music playing in the background like a razor. Clara, Vance said, his voice dropping into a low, patronizing register that made my skin crawl. We are having the prime rib as a table. The Bordeaux has already been ordered. A Riesling does not complement the flavor profile of the meat. You know this. We discussed the menu before we left the house. I know, honey, Clara stammered, her face instantly flushing a deep, humiliated crimson. I just really preferred the sea base tonight. I'm not feeling very well, and the red meat feels too heavy. You don't choose an entree based on your fleeting whims at a dinner of this caliber, Clara, Vance interrupted, his voice dropping an octave, carrying a subtle, venomous edge. It shows a complete lack of sophistication. It embarrasses me. The young waiter stood paralyzed, his digital notepad trembling slightly in his hand, his eyes darting uncomfortably between the young couple. It's quite all right, I intervened, leaning forward and offering the waiter a reassuring smile. My daughter can have the sea base, and I will join her in having the Riesling. Problem solved. Harrison Sterling let out a harsh, raspy bark of a laugh, leaning back in his chair and crossing his thick arms over his chest. Don't coddle her, Beatrice. Vance is absolutely right. Women today enter these high-end establishments and treat them like a local diner. They have no concept of culinary etiquette. In my day, a wife looked at her husband's selection first before she even opened her mouth to the staff. I felt my jaw tighten, my fingernails digging into the palms of my hands beneath the tablecloth. This isn't your day, Harrison. It is a family dinner. Let it go, Mom, Clara whispered frantically, her voice cracking. She looked at the waiter, her eyes wide with a desperate, pleading terror. I'm sorry. Change my order to the prime rib. And the red wine is fine. Thank you. The waiter nodded quickly, practically fleeing from our table to escape the suffocating tension. Clara lowered her head, her long hair falling forward to shield her face from my gaze. But as she reached across the table to reposition her water glass, her movement was a bit too hasty. The long, structured silk sleeve of her blouse caught on the edge of the silver bread basket, riding up her forearm by a few agonizing inches. Just a few inches. But it was enough. In the dim, ambient light of the restaurant, I saw them. Prominent, dark purple and yellowish bruises wrapping around the delicate skin of her wrist. They were clearly defined, shaped like the brutal, crushing pressure of a man's fingers. There were older, greenish marks further up her arm, evidence of a cycle that had been repeating for months, if not longer. My breath caught in my throat. The room seemed to tilt on its axis, the sounds of the restaurant fading into a distant, underwater drone. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Clara, I choked out, my voice barely a whisper, filled with a sudden, overwhelming maternal agony. Your arm. Clara snapped her arm back down instantly, yanking the silk sleeve over her wrist with a frantic, violent motion. She looked up at me, her eyes completely flooded with a deep, paralyzing panic. It's nothing, Mom, she whispered, her lips trembling so violently she could barely form the words. I was clumsy. I tripped over Leo's toy blocks in the hallway yesterday. Please. Drop it. But I knew. A mother's intuition isn't a theory, it is a physical reaction. I looked across at Vance, who was calmly adjusting his gold cufflinks, his face entirely unbothered, a faint, smug smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. He knew I had seen it. And he didn't care. To understand the depth of the horror that gripped me in that restaurant, I need to tell you about the Clara I raised. Because the woman sitting across from me at that table, cowering over a wine selection, was not my daughter. She was a hollowed-out shell, a tragic ghost of the brilliant, unyielding force of nature she used to be. Clara was born on a crisp autumn morning 34 years ago. From the moment she entered this world, she didn't just cry, she demanded to be heard. She was a child filled with an insatiable, roaring curiosity. My late husband, Arthur, who was a structural engineer, used to watch her with a look of profound awe. When she was only 7 years old, she didn't play with dolls, she took apart old grandfather clocks and broken radios in our garage, meticulously mapping out the gears and wires on graph paper to understand how they functioned. I remember a specific summer afternoon when she was 9. A heavy storm had knocked down a massive oak branch in our backyard, crushing a small bird's nest. Clara didn't cry. Instead, she spent 3 hours in the pouring rain, using scraps of plywood, mesh wire, and weatherproofing glue to construct a miniature, structurally reinforced sanctuary for the displaced birds. When she brought it inside, soaked to the bone but beaming with absolute determination, she looked at me and said, Mom, the world can be incredibly loud and destructive. But if you have the right tools, you can build a safe place where nothing can hurt you. That was Clara. She grew up loving the hard sciences. She possessed a mind that cut through complexity like a diamond through glass. She earned a full academic scholarship to an Ivy League university, eventually securing her doctorate in biochemistry. She was hired by a prestigious research laboratory, where she led a team developing targeted therapies for autoimmune diseases. She had her own penthouse apartment, her own substantial income, her own fierce, independent life. She was a woman who took up space in a room. She spoke with authority, laughed from her chest, and never, ever apologized for being the smartest person in the room. And then, she met Vance Sterling at a charity gala for the university hospital. At the beginning of their relationship, Vance was the perfect architect of deception. He was incredibly attentive, presenting himself as a modern, progressive man who was completely captivated by her intellect. He would send magnificent arrangements of white orchids to her laboratory, leave thoughtful, handwritten notes in her briefcase, and sit for hours listening to her explain complex molecular structures without ever interrupting. Clara was completely blinded by the romance. I remember her sitting in my kitchen, her eyes illuminated with a radiant, blissful glow as she sipped her coffee. "Mom," she had told me, her voice filled with a profound sense of certainty. "I've spent my whole life building a career, but with Vance, I feel like I finally found a partner who isn't intimidated by my strength. He wants to build a life with me, not around me." The wedding was a grand, spectacular affair held at a historic estate in Newport. It was a sea of white roses, classical string quartets, and high society guest lists. Arthur had already passed away by then, his absence a heavy ache in my chest, but I walked Clara down the aisle myself. When I placed her hand in Vance's, I looked him dead in the eye and said, "Take care of her heart, Vance. She is a rare treasure." He smiled, that flawless, practiced smile, and replied, "With my entire life, Beatrice. She is my crown jewel." The first year of their marriage seemed stable from the outside, but looking back with the agonizing clarity of hindsight, I realized the seeds of psychological control were being planted early. Vance began making small, seemingly innocuous comments about her career. When she would come home late from a critical breakthrough at the lab, he would greet her with a sigh, saying, "Clara, my fund makes enough in a week to finance your lab for a year. You're exhausting yourself for pennies. Don't you think our home deserves your brilliance more than a petri dish?" He framed his control as chivalry. He convinced her that her independence was actually a burden she no longer needed to carry. When Clara became pregnant with Leo, the pressure intensified into an ultimatum disguised as medical concern. Vance brought in high-priced private physicians who conveniently echoed his sentiments, claiming that the stress of the laboratory environment could jeopardize the pregnancy. Clara resisted at first. She loved her research, it was part of her identity. But she also loved the child growing inside her. Seeking validation, she had come to me, her voice laced with anxiety. "Mom, Vance thinks I should take a sabbatical. He says a mother's true masterpiece is her child. Maybe he's right. Maybe I'm being selfish by wanting to keep my career." I had held her hands tightly, sensing a subtle undercurrent of danger I couldn't quite articulate yet. "Clara, whatever you choose, make sure it is your choice. A husband should be a wind beneath your wings, not a cage that keeps you from flying." She had smiled, but it was the first time I noticed that her laughter didn't come from her chest anymore. It was quiet. Contained. Leo was born on a freezing December morning. He was a spectacular, healthy boy with Clara's brilliant, observant eyes. Vance was ecstatic, but his joy was entirely performative. He organized a massive, televised gala to introduce his heir to the high society circles of the city. He invited hundreds of business associates, politicians, and media personalities. Clara was completely exhausted, suffering from a difficult delivery and postpartum fatigue. She had pleaded with him to have a small, intimate family gathering instead. But Vance had overridden her completely, stating that the sterling family name required a standard of public presentation. I attended that gala. I watched my daughter move through the sea of tuxedoed men and diamond-clad women like a well-trained mannequin. She carried Leo in her arms, her face pale, her smile fixed and artificial, answering the same invasive questions over and over again while Vance stood at the bar, clinking glasses with his investors, basking in the congratulations without holding his newborn son a single time. Months blurred into years, and Clara never went back to the laboratory. Vance managed to systematically cut off her access to her old life. He convinced her to close her independent bank accounts, merging everything into a trust controlled entirely by him and his father. He subtly alienated her from her college friends, making derogatory remarks about their lifestyles until Clara simply stopped calling them. Every time I visited their immaculate, multi-million-dollar mansion in the suburbs, the environment felt sterile, devoid of life. The house was too clean, too silent. Clara was always buzzing around like an anxious servant, organizing Vance's wardrobe, ensuring the kitchen was stocked with his specific organic ingredients, apologizing constantly for things that required no apology. I'm sorry the tea isn't hot enough, Mom. I'm sorry Leo made a smudge on the glass panel. I'm sorry I forgot to call you yesterday. Vance was stressed about a market dip and I needed to make sure the house was completely quiet. She was apologizing for her very existence. She had become an architect who no longer built anything, a scientist who no longer questioned anything, a woman who lived in perpetual, paralyzing fear of causing a ripple in her husband's perfect world. 6 months before this fateful dinner, I had arrived at her house unannounced to drop off a handmade sweater for Leo. I knocked on the massive mahogany door several times before Clara finally opened it. She was in a state of complete dishevelment, her hair pulled back in a frantic knot, deep, dark shadows beneath her eyes, her hands trembling. "Mom, you should have called," she had whispered, looking over her shoulder into the empty, echoing hallway of the mansion. "I wanted to surprise you, Clara. When was the last time you left this house? When was the last time you went for a walk in the park?" She had looked away, shrugging her shoulders defensively. "I don't need to go out, Mom. Vance provides everything. I have a gym, a chef's kitchen, a private courtyard. I have everything." We sat in her sprawling, white marble kitchen. I made a pot of tea and forced her to sit down, taking her hands in mine. They were ice cold, devoid of the vibrant warmth they used to possess. "Clara, look at me," I had demanded softly. "Are you happy? Tell me the truth. You can tell me anything." A long, suffocating silence had filled the kitchen, a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. A single tear had escaped her eye, tracking down her pale cheek, before she quickly wiped it away, her expression hardening into a defensive mask. "I'm tired, Mom," she had replied, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "But all wives are tired. Marriage requires sacrifice. Vance loves me. He just has a very intense way of ensuring our family stays on the right path." It wasn't an answer. It was a script, a narrative that had been pounded into her head until she accepted it as her reality. And because I wanted to preserve the peace, because I didn't want to alienate my daughter further, I didn't push harder. I accepted her silence. And that acceptance became the greatest regret of my life. Back inside the obsidian room, the main courses had been served, but the food tasted like ash in my mouth. I couldn't stop looking at Clara's sleeve, my mind racing with a mixture of blinding rage and a terrifying sense of helplessness. I wanted to scream at Vance, to drag my daughter out of that oppressive room, to call the authorities, to tear down the entire Sterling Empire with my bare hands. But every time my eyes met Clara's, she gave me a silent, agonizing look of supplication. She was begging me not to make a scene. She was terrified of what would happen when the dinner ended, when the public eye was removed, and she was left alone with Vance in the quiet confinement of their car. So, I forced myself to sit in agony, playing the part of the polite, quiet grandmother. I watched the grotesque display of masculine arrogance unfolding before me. Harrison Sterling was in the middle of a loud, self-aggrandizing story about how he had crushed a labor union at one of his manufacturing plants, his voice dripping with absolute contempt for anyone he deemed beneath his social station. The secret to management, Vance, whether it's a multi-billion-dollar corporation or a household, is absolute authority, Harrison stated, taking a heavy gulp of his Bordeaux. The moment you allow the subordinates to think they have an equal say, the structure destabilizes. You have to establish the hierarchy early, and you have to enforce it without hesitation. "I agree entirely, Dad," Vance replied, his eyes shining with a sickening devotion to his father's cruelty. "A lot of my colleagues let their wives manage the family foundations, give speeches at galas, handle the finances. It's pathetic. It ruins the dynamic. A woman's mind isn't built for the volatility of high-stakes environments. They lack the emotional discipline." Clara kept her eyes fixed entirely on her plate, her fork mechanically moving a piece of meat back and forth without ever lifting it to her mouth. Evelyn sat beside her, looking like a statue carved from grief, entirely desensitized to the verbal degradation of her entire gender. Then, the final act of the dinner arrived. The waiter returned to clear the table and take the dessert orders. Harrison ordered a glass of 20-year-old scotch. Vance demanded a traditional tiramisu. Evelyn quietly stated she didn't want anything. The waiter turned to Clara. "And for you, madam?" Clara swallowed hard, her voice a faint whisper. I would like the chocolate lava cake, please." The waiter nodded, noting the order, and disappeared into the kitchen. A few minutes later, the dessert tray arrived. The waiter, clearly stressed by the palpable tension radiating from our table, began distributing the plates. He placed the scotch in front of Harrison, the tiramisu in front of Vance, and then he set a plate down in front of Clara. Except it wasn't the chocolate lava cake. In his haste, he had brought a raspberry tart instead. Clara looked down at the plate, her face instantly turning pale. "Oh, excuse me," she said softly, her voice trembling as she looked at the waiter. I think I ordered the chocolate." "Oh, I am so profoundly sorry, madam," the waiter interrupted, his face flushing with panic. "Let me take this back immediately and have the chef prepare the lava cake. It will only take a moment." No, please, it's completely fine," Clara said quickly, her voice laced with a sudden, desperate urgency. She reached out to cover the plate with her hands as if protecting it. "I can eat the raspberry tart." "Really? It doesn't matter at all. Please don't trouble yourself." "Madam, it is no trouble at all, it was my mistake. I said it's fine." Clara's voice rose slightly, a note of sheer panic piercing through her tone. But it was too late. The minor ripple had been created. The perfect, orderly universe that Vance demanded had been disrupted by a common worker's error and his wife's clumsy handling of it. Vance slowly raised his right hand, snapping his fingers sharply to summon the restaurant manager, who had been watching our table from a discreet distance near the wine cellar. The manager hurried over, his expression a mix of elite sycophancy and deep anxiety. "Mr. Sterling, is there a problem with the service?" "A problem?" Vance asked, his voice low, controlled but vibrating with a terrifying, latent malice. "Look at this table. My wife ordered a specific item. Your staff brought the wrong dish. And instead of handling the situation with dignity, my wife is sitting here negotiating with a waiter like a peasant. Is this the standard of operations at the Obsidian Room? Do we pay premium membership fees to have our orders botched and our dinners turned into a circus?" "Vance, please," Clara whispered, her eyes filling with tears, her shoulders physically shrinking. "It's just a dessert. It's really not a big deal. You're embarrassing me." "Am I embarrassing you?" Vance turned his head toward her, his facial features contorting into an expression of absolute, venomous rage. The mask of the polished, educated hedge fund manager completely slipped away, revealing the raw, ugly face of a tyrant. "Or are you embarrassing me? You can't even manage a simple interaction with a waiter without sounding like an incompetent child. You always do this. You always find a way to degrade our standing in public." "Michael, please, people are looking," Clara sobbed, her voice breaking as she noticed several neighboring tables turning their heads toward our corner. "I don't give a damn who is looking," Vance hissed. And then, in a movement so sudden, so brutal, so completely unexpected in a civilized establishment, Vance reached across the space between their chairs. He didn't just slap her, he didn't just shove her. He reached out and grabbed Clara by the hair at the back of her head. He fistfuled her long, dark hair and pulled her head back with immense, violent force, wrenching her face upward so she was forced to look directly into his eyes. The entire restaurant went dead silent. The ambient music seemed to vanish. The manager stood completely paralyzed, his mouth open in horror. The waiters froze mid-stride. The elite diners at neighboring tables turned their heads, their expressions filled with shock, but not a single person moved. Not a single man stood up. Clara did not scream. She didn't have the voice left for it. She only let out a tiny, choked, animalistic whimper, a sound of profound, broken humiliation that tore through my chest like a physical blade. Her hands clutched frantically at the edge of the mahogany table, her body trembling violently, tears instantly streaming down her face, her neck twisted at an unnatural, painful angle. And in that terrifying, suffocating silence, a sound echoed from our table. It was a loud, sharp, rhythmic sound. Clapping. I looked over, my chest heaving, and saw Harrison Sterling. The patriarch was leaning back in his chair, a wide, triumphant grin stretching across his face, his thick hands coming together in a slow, deliberate applause. "That is how it's done, son. That is exactly how it's done." Harrison boomed, his raspy voice cutting through the silent restaurant like a foghorn. He slammed his open palm down on the table, making the crystal glasses rattle. "A woman who doesn't respect her husband's position needs to be taught her place immediately. If she can't maintain dignity in public, she deserves the discipline." "Well done." Vance smiled, a cold, psychotic reflection of his father's approval, and abruptly let go of Clara's hair, shoving her head forward. Clara collapsed onto her plate, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with violent, uncontrollable sobs. She cried in complete silence, the quiet, agonizing weeping of a woman who had fully accepted that her pain did not matter, that her safety did not exist, and that no one was coming to save her. Beside her, Evelyn Sterling kept her eyes fixed entirely on her empty plate, her face an expressionless mask, as if she had witnessed this exact scene 1,000 times in her own home and had learned long ago that survival meant pretending the horror wasn't happening. And inside me, something broke. 40 years of academic restraint, 40 years of polite socialization, 40 years of being the quiet, dignified woman who kept the peace, it all evaporated, replaced by a roaring, primeval fire. My hands stopped trembling. The ice in my veins turned to pure, molten lava. I reached down into my clutch, my fingers brushing against my grandmother's frozen silver pocket watch. I squeezed it tightly, drawing strength from the generations of silent women who had suffered before me. And then, I stood up. When I stood up, the atmospheric pressure in the obsidian room dropped to absolute zero. Every single eye in the establishment, the diners, the waitstaff, the chefs looking through the glass kitchen windows, the security guards at the door, pivoted entirely to me. I stood at my full height, my posture perfectly erect, pulling the emerald velvet gown around me like a battle cloak. I looked down at Vance, who was calmly wiping his fingers with a linen napkin, entirely unbothered by his own monstrosity. I looked at Harrison, who was pouring himself another splash of scotch, a look of smug superiority still plastered on his face. I extended my hand toward my daughter, my voice cutting through the silent room with a sharp, resonant clarity that I hadn't used since my days lecturing in crowded university auditoriums. "Clara," I said, my voice completely devoid of hesitation. "Stand up. Get your things. We are leaving." Clara looked up through her tangled hair, her face smeared with tears and running mascara, her eyes wide with an absolute, paralyzing terror. "Mom, no, please," she whispered, looking frantically between me and her husband. "Don't do this. Please sit down. You're going to make it worse." "It cannot get any worse than this, Clara," I replied, my tone firm, steady, carrying the absolute weight of a mother's command. "Stand up. Right now." "Nancy, sit your old ass down," Harrison scoffed, leaning forward, his eyes narrowing with a look of pure contempt. "You're making a public spectacle out of a private family matter." Vance was simply exercising his right as a husband to manage his household. "This doesn't concern you." I turned my gaze slowly to Harrison, letting the full force of my disgust radiate from my eyes. "A private family matter, Harrison?" He pulled my daughter's hair in a public restaurant. He laid his hands on her like an animal. And you sat there and cheered him on like a savage at a blood sport. "This concerns me more than anything else in this world." Vance stood up slowly, adjusting the buttons of his tailored suit jacket, his expression shifting into that dangerous, patronizing mask. He took a step toward me, his voice dropping into that low, threatening register. "Beatrice, I think you are profoundly misunderstanding the situation here." It was a moment of high tension. Clara has been incredibly unstable lately, suffering from severe anxiety. I merely used a firm physical anchor to bring her back to reality. It's an anger management technique recommended by professionals. Clara understands. Don't you, honey? He looked down at Clara, his eyes issuing a silent, lethal promise of retribution if she disagreed. Clara nodded her head rapidly, like a broken puppet whose strings were being yanked by a cruel master. Yes, Mom, it's true, she stammered, her voice cracking into a sob. Vance didn't mean to hurt me. It was my fault. I provoked him. I shouldn't have argued about the dessert. He's under so much pressure with the firm's merger this week. I understand him. You understand him? I asked, my heart breaking into a million pieces as I listened to my brilliant, independent daughter defend the man who was systematically destroying her. You understand a man who leaves fingerprints on your wrists, Clara? A man who forces you to wear long sleeves in May to hide the evidence of his love? The restaurant let out a collective, audible gasp. The neighboring diners began whispering furiously, their eyes shifting from Vance to Clara's covered arms. Vance's face turned a violent, mottled shade of purple. The facade of the educated gentleman was completely gone now. That is enough, Beatrice. You are crossing a line. Clara is my wife. She belongs to the Sterling estate. She lives in a house that I paid for, she drives a vehicle that I registered, she eats food that my finance fund secures. She goes where I tell her to go, and she stays when I tell her to stay. She is not a piece of real estate, Vance. I roared, my voice booming through the restaurant, shattering the remaining illusion of high society decorum. She is a human being. She is a scientist. She is a mother. And she is my daughter. I stepped around the table, pushing past the paralyzed restaurant manager. I reached down and gently but firmly took hold of Clara's right arm. Mom, no, please. Clara cried out, trying to pull away, her eyes flooded with panic. But I didn't let go. With a swift, deliberate movement, I grabbed the cuff of her structured satin blouse and ripped the buttons away, sliding the sleeve all the way up to her elbow. I grabbed her arm and lifted it high into the air, holding it directly beneath the bright glow of the center chandelier, exposing the brutal, dark purple fingerprints, the greenish bruises, and the raw, healing skin to the entire room. Before we find out what happened next in the story, I want to take a brief moment to speak directly to anyone watching who might be going through their own sudden, overwhelming transition. If you are navigating a bitter divorce, the loss of a spouse, or a financial shock, you know the hardest part isn't just the money, it's not knowing what to do first. That is exactly why we created the Phoenix Blueprint. It is a practical, step-by-step guide for starting over. It doesn't have fluffy affirmations or vision boards. It is a tactical survival manual. It gives you the exact checklist for the first 48 hours, including the one rule you must follow: do not make any decision you cannot reverse. It includes the Found Money worksheet, showing you exactly how to check state databases, because 1 in 7 Americans actually has unclaimed money waiting for them right now. It even gives you word-for-word boundary scripts to use when family members pressure you for money or try to make decisions for you. You can get the entire guide right now for just $17. If you're watching on your TV, just pull out your phone, open your camera, and scan the QR code on the screen right now. If you're on a computer or phone, click the top link in the description. You don't have to figure this out alone. Now, let's get back to the story. Look at this. I shouted to the entire restaurant, turning my head to face the crowded tables of wealthy elites who had spent the evening pretending not to see. Look at what the Sterling family name buys. This isn't high society. This isn't marital discipline. This isn't stress management. This is violence. This is abuse. This is a crime. And it ends tonight. The restaurant went into a frenzy. Several women at neighboring tables covered their mouths, tears springing to their eyes. 2 men stood up from a nearby table, their expressions turning angry as they looked at Vance. Harrison Sterling slammed his fist onto the table again, standing up so violently his chair flipped backward onto the charcoal carpet. You crazy, academic bitch. You are destroying our reputation. Security. Get this old woman out of here right now. But the security guards didn't move. They stood near the entrance, their arms crossed, their eyes fixed entirely on Harrison and Vance with a cold, disgust-filled resolve. The restaurant manager finally found his voice, stepping between Vance and my daughter. "Mr. Sterling, I think it is best if you and your father leave our establishment immediately. We have already contacted the authorities, and the police are on their way." Vance let out a dry, hysterical laugh, his eyes darting around the hostel room like a cornered rat. "The police? Do you know who my father is? We finance the police commissioner's charity gala. We own the city council. Come on, Clara. We're leaving. Now." He reached out to grab Clara's other arm, but I stepped directly into his path, placing my body between him and my daughter. I reached into my velvet gown, pulled out my grandmother's heavy silver pocket watch, and slammed it down onto the table with a resounding clatter. "You won't touch her ever again, Vance," I said, my voice dropping into a lethal, quiet whisper that made him freeze. "You think your money protects you? You think your father's empire shields you from accountability? You forgot who I am. I spent 30 years teaching the children of the most powerful judges, prosecutors, and journalists in this state. The district attorney was my top student. The chief investigative reporter for the state network is my nephew." I leaned in closer to his face, letting him see the absolute lack of fear in my eyes. "I have documented every single bruise Clara has tried to hide over the past year. I have photographic evidence of the marks on her neck from 3 months ago. I have records of every frantic, silent phone call she made to my house in the middle of the night. Tomorrow morning, every financial investor in your hedge fund will receive a copy of those photos. Every news outlet in this city will run a headline with your perfect, smiling face next to the broken skin of my daughter." Vance stepped back, his face completely draining of color, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. He looked at his father, but Harrison was looking away, his mind already calculating the catastrophic financial ruin that a public abuse scandal would bring to their family empire. I turned back to Clara. She was looking at me, but for the first time in 4 years, the panic in her eyes was beginning to recede. It was being replaced by a tiny, fragile spark, a reflection of the fire that had once defined her. She looked at her bruised arm, then she looked at Vance, seeing him for what he truly was, a small, cowardly boy hiding behind his father's money. Clara stood up. She didn't look at the floor. She reached down, grabbed her silk clutch, and wiped the tears from her face with a deliberate, slow movement. She turned to Vance, her voice shaking, but carrying a beautiful, resonant strength that made my soul sing. "My mother is right, Vance. I built a sanctuary for birds when I was 9 years old because the world was destructive. I forgot how to build a safe place for myself. But I haven't forgotten how to fight." She walked past him, her head held high, her velvet heels clicking firmly against the charcoal carpet. I turned to Harrison and Vance one last time, picking up my grandmother's silver pocket watch and sliding it back into my clutch. "The lesson for tonight, gentlemen, is very simple. A foundation built on cruelty, control, and silence will always collapse when a mother decides to tear it down." I walked out of the obsidian room, my arm wrapped tightly around my daughter's shoulders. As we stepped through the glass double doors into the cool, cleansing rain of the night, I felt the heavy weight of 40 years of silence lifting from my chest. We were wet, we were bruised, and the road ahead would be a long, brutal battle through courts and headlines. But as I looked at Clara, who was breathing deeply, her head turned toward the open sky, I knew that the diamond had survived the pressure. We were finally free. The descent in the glass elevator of the skyscraper felt like a slow drop from the stratosphere back to Earth. For the first 3 floors, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the rhythmic hum of the elevator's pneumatic cables and the harsh, ragged breathing that came from deep within Clara's chest. The neon blues and blinding yellows of the city skyline blurred past the glass, reflecting off the polished marble floors of the capsule. Clara stood with her back against the glass pane, her hands still trembling as she clutched the torn, buttonless fabric of her sleeve over her bruised wrist. The adrenaline that had carried her out of the obsidian room was beginning to recede, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. Her skin looked translucent in the stark overhead LED lighting of the elevator. I didn't try to touch her right away. When a person has been systematically conditioned to view physical contact as a precursor to pain or control, even a mother's comforting touch can cause them to flinch. Instead, I stood 2 feet away, positioning my body between her and the elevator door, acting as a human shield against the rest of the world. "Mom," she whispered, her voice cracking as the elevator passed the 20th floor. "My car keys, they're in Vance's jacket pocket. My wallet, my identification, Leo's medical cards, everything is in the safe at the house. I don't have anything." "You have me, Clara," I said, my voice steady, carrying the absolute, unshakable certainty of a woman who had just declared war. "And you have your life. Everything else is just paper and leather. We can buy new paper. We can issue new leather. Do not look back at what you left in that room." The elevator chimed, the doors sliding open into the grand, cavernous marble lobby of the skyscraper. The air here was cooler, carrying the damp, metallic scent of the rain from the street outside. The lobby was mostly empty, save for a few security guards in crisp uniforms who looked at us with a mixture of professional detachment and quiet curiosity. They had undoubtedly received the frantic radio transmission from the restaurant manager upstairs, but they made no move to stop us. In fact, the lead guard, a gray-haired man with an old military bearing, stepped forward and held the massive glass revolving doors open for us. As we stepped out onto the wet pavement of the avenue, the rain hit us. It wasn't the light, silent mist that had started the evening, it was a heavy, roaring downpour that washed over the city, drumming against the canvas awnings of the high-end boutiques and splashing against our heels. I raised my arm, signaling a yellow cab that was idling near the curb. The driver, an older man with kind eyes beneath a flat cap, pulled up immediately. I opened the door, helping Clara slide into the worn vinyl back seat before climbing in after her. "Where to, folks?" the driver asked, looking at us through the rearview mirror. "The historic district," I replied, giving him the address of the modest, 2-story brownstone house that Arthur and I had bought 40 years ago, the house where Clara had grown up, the house that Vance had always sneered at as an outdated relic of the middle class. The cab pulled out into the midnight traffic, its windshield wipers rhythmic and loud against the glass. Clara collapsed against my shoulder, her body finally giving way to a violent, silent fit of weeping. I wrapped my arms around her, pulling her tight against my emerald velvet gown, letting the fabric absorb her tears. I didn't tell her to stop crying. I didn't tell her that everything was going to be fine, because that would be a lie. The next few months were going to be a living hell. The Sterling family would use every resource, every lawyer, every contact, and every drop of venom they possessed to protect their name and destroy ours. But as I held my daughter in the dark back seat of that cab, listening to the rain pound against the roof, I knew that the hardest part of the battle was already won. The silence had been broken. The monster had been exposed in the light. When we arrived at the brownstone, the street was quiet, the ancient oak trees lining the sidewalk dripping with heavy water. I paid the driver, adding a substantial tip for his discretion, and guided Clara up the stone steps to the front door. My hands were perfectly steady as I inserted the heavy brass key into the lock. Stepping inside the house was like stepping into a different timeline. The air smelled of old books, lavender wax, and the faint, sweet scent of the vanilla tea I had brewed that morning before leaving. There were no white marble surfaces here, no towering glass panels designed to make a human being feel small. There were bookshelves lining the walls, worn leather armchairs that had molded to Arthur's posture over decades, and framed sketches of Clara's childhood drawings hanging in the hallway. I led her into the kitchen, the heart of the home. "Sit, Clara. Don't think. Just sit." She sat down at the old oak kitchen table, the very table where she had once done her biochemistry homework, her doctoral thesis, and her early childhood drawings. She looked around the room, her eyes adjusting to the soft, warm light of the Tiffany lamp sitting on the counter. I immediately went to work. I stripped off my elegant velvet gown, changing into a pair of worn cotton trousers and a heavy knit sweater. I brought down a basin of warm water, a clean cotton washcloth, and a fresh change of clothes for Clara, one of her old university sweatshirts and a pair of soft fleece pants that I had kept in her childhood bedroom. I sat down across from her, gently taking her bruised right arm. I soaked the cloth in the warm water and began wiping away the smudged mascara and dried tears from her cheeks, treating her with the same gentle precision I had used when she was a little girl who had fallen off her bicycle. Then, I turned my attention to her wrists. In the bright, honest light of my kitchen, the marks looked even worse than they had in the restaurant. The purple indentations of Vance's fingers were deep, almost black around the edges, showing the immense physical force he had used to pin her down. "We need to document this, Clara," I said softly, looking up into her eyes. "Not tomorrow. Not after the bruises start to fade or change color. We do it tonight. We need the raw, unedited truth before the sterling lawyers can spin a narrative about you being clumsy or unstable." Clara swallowed hard, looking at her arm. For a fraction of a second, I saw that old, familiar hesitation flash across her face, the deeply ingrained instinct to protect her abuser, to hide the shame, to avoid the public scandal. But then her gaze drifted to the framed photograph on the kitchen wall, a photo of her late father, Arthur, standing proudly next to her on the day she received her doctorate. She took a deep, shuddering breath and nodded. "My phone is in my clutch, Mom. It's still working. Use the camera." I retrieved her phone. With meticulous, clinical precision, I took dozens of high-resolution photographs of her wrists, her forearms, and the faint, red abrasions at the base of her skull where Vance had yanked her hair. I made sure the lighting was clear, capturing the distinct shapes of the finger marks from multiple angles. Once the photos were secured, I backed them up to my own private cloud storage and sent an encrypted copy to my nephew, Julian, who was the chief investigative reporter for the state television network. Attached to the images, I wrote a simple, chilling message: "The Obsidian Room. Tonight. Vance Sterling. The battle has begun." At 2 a.m., the quiet of the night was shattered by the harsh, vibrating ring of the landline telephone sitting on the kitchen wall. In the old days, I would have jumped, my heart racing with anxiety. But tonight, I expected it. I knew exactly who was on the other end of that line. I stood up, walked over to the wall, and lifted the receiver, placing it to my ear without saying a word. "Beatrice," Vance's voice hissed through the speaker, devoid of any of the smooth, polished refinement he had utilized at the restaurant. It was raw, jagged, and dripping with an unhinged, dangerous fury. "You have exactly 20 minutes to return my wife to our home before I file a formal police report for kidnapping and custodial interference regarding Leo." I let out a low, cold laugh that seemed to catch him completely off guard. "Kidnapping, Vance? Clara is an adult citizen who walked out of a public restaurant of her own free will after you assaulted her in front of 50 witnesses. And as for Leo, you left him at your house with a hired nanny because you deemed him a distraction to your prestigious dinner. You don't care about that boy. You care about your control. Listen to me, you old academic parasite," Vance snarled, his breath heavy against the microphone. "You think you played a clever hand tonight? You think a few gasps from a room full of upper-class diners means anything in this city? My father has already spoken to the managing partner of the firm. Your nephew's news network relies on Sterling media advertisements for 40% of their revenue. If a single word of this dinner leaks, your nephew will be working at a regional radio station by Monday morning. The district attorney is a political creature, Beatrice. He doesn't bite the hand that finances his re-election campaign. Are you finished, Vance? I asked, my voice completely flat, completely unbothered by his threats. Return her tonight, or I will dismantle whatever is left of your family's pathetic little life, he threatened. I will tie Clara up in litigation until she is penniless. She will never see a dime of the trust fund. She will never see her son again. I will project her as an unstable, manic woman who abandoned her child in the middle of the night. You don't have the stomach for the kind of war we wage, Beatrice. You're right about one thing, Vance, I replied, leaning against the kitchen counter, looking at Clara, who was watching me with an expression of intense focus. I don't have the stomach for your kind of war. Because your war relies on shadows, bribes, and the quiet compliance of women who are too afraid to lose their status. But my war relies on the one thing that your money cannot buy, structural integrity. I leaned in closer to the receiver. Before we left the obsidian room, the restaurant manager confirmed that their entire main dining room is monitored by high-definition security cameras for liability insurance purposes. The cameras captured every single angle of your movement, the moment you reached across the table, the moment you fistfuled my daughter's hair, and the moment your father stood up to applaud the violence. The line went completely silent for 3 seconds. I could hear the faint sound of Vance's heavy breathing, the sudden realization of a structural flaw in his defenses beginning to register in his mind. The manager has already secured the digital footage, I continued, letting a cold smile play on my lips. And because he values his restaurant's liquor license and insurance policy more than your father's volatile ego, he handed a digital copy of that footage to the police officers who arrived at the scene 15 minutes after we left. By 8 a.m. tomorrow, that video will be sitting on the desk of every major regulatory board that oversees your hedge fund's compliance certificates. Let's see how many of your elite investors want to keep their multi-million-dollar portfolios managed by a man whose face is broadcast on the morning news yanking his wife's hair like a barbarian. You wouldn't dare, Vance whispered, his voice cracking, the first note of genuine panic piercing through his arrogance. It would ruin Clara's reputation, too. She'll be the talk of the high society circles. She'll be public gossip. Clara doesn't care about your high society circles anymore, Vance, I said, looking at my daughter, who gave me a firm, resolute nod. She's coming back to the laboratory. She's coming back to the real world. Good night, son-in-law. I slammed the receiver back onto the hook, severing the connection. Clara stood up from the oak table, her posture straight, her eyes bright with a fierce, calculating intelligence that I hadn't seen since her university days. He's going to go to the house in the suburbs, Mom. He's going to try to lock down the estate, hide Leo, and destroy whatever personal records I left behind. Then we don't give him the chance, I replied, grabbing my car keys from the counter. The police are already processing the report at the central precinct. We go there now, secure an emergency temporary protection order, and we take a police escort to that mansion to retrieve my grandson. We build the safe place tonight, Clara. The Central Police Precinct at 3:30 a.m. was a place of harsh fluorescent lights, the smell of stale coffee, and the constant, chaotic hum of late-night arrests and paperwork. But we didn't sit in the common waiting area. Because of the high-profile nature of the Sterling family and the explosive evidence we brought with us, we were escorted directly into a private office. The detective assigned to the case was a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Miller. She looked at the photographs of Clara's arms, reviewed the preliminary statement from the Obsidian Room's manager, and looked at the digital copy of the security footage that had been transferred to her system. This isn't a standard domestic dispute, Mrs. Vance, Detective Miller said, her eyes fixed on the screen showing Vance's brutal movement. This is an overt, aggravated assault in a public space. Combined with the evidence of prior, patterned abuse on her arms, we have more than enough grounds for an immediate, emergency restraining order and an order of protection for the child. By 5 a.m., the paperwork was stamped, signed by a night court judge, and validated. 2 marked police cruisers were dispatched to accompany us to the Sterling mansion in the affluent suburbs. The sun was just beginning to rise when the police escort pulled up the long, winding cobblestone driveway of the estate. The morning light was a pale, cold gray, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns and the white marble columns of the massive house. It was a house that looked like a fortress from the outside, but as we stepped out of the police vehicle, I knew it was nothing but a gilded cage that was about to be dismantled. The front door opened before we could even reach the steps. Vance stood in the doorway, his hair disheveled, his tie undone, his face a pale, sweating mask of absolute ruin. Behind him stood Harrison Sterling, talking furiously into a cell phone, his gravelly voice sounding desperate as he tried to contact his corporate lawyers. Vance looked at the police officers, then at the paperwork in Detective Miller's hand, and finally at Clara, who stood at the front of our line, her head held high, completely unbothered by his presence. "Clara, please," Vance stammered, stepping forward, his hands open in a gesture of desperate supplication. "Let's talk about this inside. We can settle this privately. My father is already working on a restructuring of the trust accounts. We can give you whatever you want. We can arrange a private sabbatical for you, anything." Clara didn't answer him. She didn't look at his open hands. She looked past him into the grand foyer, where the agency nanny was standing near the curved staircase, holding my 4-year-old grandson, Leo, in her arms. "Detective Miller," Clara said, her voice completely calm, completely steady. "Please enforce the order of protection. I am here to retrieve my son and my personal belongings." Vance tried to step in her way, his face contorting with a final, desperate flash of rage. "You can't just walk out of my life, Clara. I made you. I gave you everything." Detective Miller stepped forward, placing a firm, gloved hand on Vance's chest, pushing him back with absolute authority. "Mr. Sterling, step away from your wife immediately. If you attempt to interfere with the execution of this court order, or if you make any physical contact with Madam Lynn, you will be placed under arrest on the spot. Step back." Vance froze, his eyes darting to his father, but Harrison had already hung up his phone, his face an expressionless mask of defeat. The Sterling name could buy a lot of things, but it couldn't buy its way out of a multi-witness assault captured on high-definition video and enforced by a state judge. Clara walked past her husband without a single glance. She ran up the curved staircase, taking Leo into her arms, holding him tight against her chest as the little boy let out a happy cry of "Mommy." I stood in the foyer, watching her come down the stairs with my grandson, her face illuminated by the first true, radiant smile I had seen in 4 long years. She looked like the diamond she was, unbroken, brilliant, and completely free of the pressure that had tried to crush her. As we walked out of the mansion, leaving the Sterling family behind in the cold morning light, I looked at the silver pocket watch in my hand. The internal gears were still frozen, but for the first time in my life, I felt like time was moving forward again. The silence was over. The lesson had been taught. And our family was finally home. The standard response of a cornered beast from the upper echelons of society is not to look inward with remorse, but to unleash an avalanche of institutional terror. Harrison Sterling and his son did not accept the humiliation at the suburban estate as a final defeat. For individuals who have spent their entire existence manipulating regulatory bodies, purchasing judicial favors, and silencing dissent through financial starvation, our initial victory was viewed merely as an irritating glitch in their system, a minor structural flaw that could be flattened with enough cash and intimidation. By 2 p.m. that Friday, the legal machinery of the Sterling conglomerate roared to life. My brownstone house, which had stood as a quiet sanctuary of literature and memory for 40 years, became the target of a high-priced corporate siege. A black luxury sedan pulled up to the curb, and a courier in a tailored suit marched up my stone steps, delivering a thick, linen-wrapped envelope that contained a multi-pronged legal counterattack. Vance had not filed a simple divorce petition. Assisted by a team of 6 high-priced family law attorneys from the state's most predatory firm, he had filed for an emergency ex parte hearing to revoke our temporary protection order, paired with a civil lawsuit against me for defamation, tortious interference with contractual relations, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The documents were a masterclass in psychological projection. Clara was described as a highly volatile, emotionally unstable individual suffering from severe postpartum complications, while I was characterized as a vindictive, overbearing matriarch using academic influence to engineer a fraudulent narrative of domestic abuse for financial extortion. Clara sat at the oak kitchen table, surrounded by the legal briefs, her face turning a pale, familiar shade of gray as she read the aggressive, gaslighting language. "Mom," she whispered, her fingers trembling against the heavy paper. "Look at this affidavit from Dr. Charles. He's the private concierge physician Vance hired after Leo was born. He signed a statement claiming he treated me for severe anxiety and hallucinatory perceptions of physical trauma 6 months ago. They're setting the foundation to prove I'm a manic-depressive parent who fabricates injuries." They are building a house out of cards, Clara, I said, my voice carrying the calm, absolute authority of a scholar who spent 30 years analyzing the structural flaws of tragic villains. They think that because they have a licensed signature, they have a truth. But a lie requires constant maintenance. The truth simply sits there and waits for the light. I pulled out my private address book, a worn leather volume containing the personal contact numbers of 30 years of university alumni. I didn't call a commercial law firm. I dialed a direct, private line to the office of Elena Vanskovac, a woman who had graduated at the absolute top of my comparative literature seminar 22 years ago, and who now served as the head of the state's most formidable nonprofit legal defense foundation for victims of institutional violence. Within 2 hours, Elena arrived at my brownstone. She didn't wear the flashy, ostentatious jewelry of the Sterling attorneys. She carried a battered leather briefcase and wore a sharp, minimalist navy suit. She sat with Clara for 4 hours, meticulously cataloging the physical evidence, the timeline of isolation, the financial coercion, and the exact names of every individual present at the Obsidian Room. The Sterlings are relying on an old playbook, Elena said, her sharp eyes scanning the affidavit from the concierge doctor. They want to drag this into a closed, confidential family court chamber where they can use their political connections with older, conservative judges to suppress the video evidence and starve you out through endless continuances. Our strategy must be the exact opposite. We do not negotiate in the dark. We pull the curtains wide open. The first major confrontation was set for Monday morning at the county family courthouse, a sterile, limestone monument where the destiny of our family unit would be contested under the harsh glare of public scrutiny. Monday morning arrived with a blinding, oppressive humidity that made the air outside the courthouse feel like a physical weight. The plaza was a chaotic sea of media vans, camera crews, and security details. My nephew, Julian, had executed his assignment with absolute, devastating precision. The state television network had spent the entire weekend running teasers about an explosive investigation into the dark underbelly of high society domestic violence, featuring leaked stills from the Obsidian Room's security footage showing Vance's fist buried in my daughter's hair. When our vehicle pulled up to the courthouse curb, the camera flashes erupted in a synchronized, deafening frenzy. Vance and Harrison Sterling were already there, flanked by their legal phalanx, moving through the crowd with an expression of cold, arrogant disdain. Vance had returned to his standard public presentation, his hair perfectly sculpted, his suit pristine, his facial features fixed in an expression of wounded innocence. As we walked up the massive stone steps, Harrison Sterling stepped out of his defensive circle, intercepting me near the heavy bronze entrance doors. His gravelly voice was a low, menacing rumble meant only for my ears. You think you've won a media war, Beatrice? Enjoy your 15 minutes of television gossip. By noon today, the judge will issue a total gag order on this case. The video will be legally suppressed from any future broadcast, and my son will walk out of that courtroom with full custody of his heir. You played a very loud game, but we own the arena. The arena is made of stone, Harrison, I replied, looking him directly in his cold, calculating eyes without breaking my stride. But stone crumbles when the ground shifts beneath it. The courtroom was packed to absolute capacity, journalists, legal observers, and members of the city's elite who had come to watch the public execution of a legacy name. Judge Thomas presiding was a stern, white-haired traditionalist who had a reputation for favoring high society decorum and treating domestic disputes as private matters that should be settled behind closed doors. The Sterling lead counsel stood up, his voice projecting a polished, theatrical indignation. Your Honor, we are requesting an immediate, absolute emergency injunction against the validation of this protection order. My client, a respected financial executive and philanthropist, has been the victim of a coordinated, malicious character assassination campaign orchestrated by a disgruntled mother-in-law and an emotionally unstable spouse. The highly selective, unverified video footage currently circulating on trash television networks is a complete distortion of a minor, private marital disagreement. It was an anger management technique used to anchor a manic individual. We are also demanding the immediate return of the child, Leo Sterling, to his legal primary residence. He sat down, offering a smug, self-satisfied look toward Vance, who nodded with practiced gravity. Judge Thomas looked down over his spectacles at Elena, his expression guarded, his traditionalist bias palpable in the room. The defense may present its argument. But let me be perfectly clear, counselor, I will not turn my courtroom into a media circus. If this is a matter of standard marital friction, it will be handled confidentially. Elena stood up slowly, her posture entirely devoid of theatricality. She didn't read from a script. She walked to the center of the courtroom, holding a simple digital tablet connected to the room's projection system. Your Honor, Elena's voice resonated through the high-ceiling chamber like a bell. We are not here to discuss standard marital friction. We are here to dismantle a multi-generational criminal conspiracy of domestic torture and corporate silencing. We are not asking you to rely on media gossip. We are asking you to look at the cold, unedited, structural reality of what occurred inside the obsidian room. She pressed a button on her tablet. The massive digital screens on the courtroom walls flickered to life. It wasn't a still image. It was the full, uninterrupted, high-definition security footage from the restaurant. The audio, which had been enhanced by forensics experts, cut through the quiet courtroom with a sickening clarity. The room listened as Vance's voice rose into that cold, dangerous condescension. And then, the visual hit the screen. The quick, brutal, savage movement as Vance's hand tangled in Clara's hair, wrenching her spine backward at an unnatural, agonizing angle. The sound of her choked, animalistic whimper echoed through the speakers, followed instantly by the booming, raspy applause of Harrison Sterling shouting, "That is how it's done, son. She has to know her place." The effect on the courtroom was immediate and devastating. Several journalists gasped aloud. The bailiff at the door shifted his posture, his expression hardening into pure disgust as he glared at Vance. Even Judge Thomas sat back in his leather chair, his face turning a deep, shocked shade of ash gray as he watched the raw, unadulterated cruelty display over and over again on the screen. Your Honor, the Sterling counsel shouted, standing up frantically, his polished composure completely shattering. This video is highly prejudicial. It has not been authenticated by an independent technician. It is an invasion of privacy. Be seated, counselor, Judge Thomas interrupted, his voice dropping into a dangerous, low register that sent a shiver through the Sterling legal team. He didn't look at the attorneys, his eyes remained fixed on Vance, who had suddenly lost his arrogant expression, a pale, cold sweat glistening at the base of his hairline. The video is clear. The physical action is undeniable. And the verbal validation from the father is monstrous. Elena didn't let up. She advanced to the next piece of evidence, the medical forensics report and the high-resolution photographs I had taken in my kitchen. The screens changed to show the horrific, deep purple fingerprints wrapping around Clara's wrists, juxtaposed with older, greenish-yellow bruises that proved a sustained, systematic history of physical violence. This is not a manic hallucination, Your Honor, Elena stated, her voice dropping to a level of quiet fury that commanded absolute attention. These are the structural markers of a cage. For 4 years, the Sterling family used their immense financial power to isolate a brilliant biochemist, to systematically strip away her independent financial resources, her professional identity, and her human dignity. They believed that because they bought the tables at the city's finest restaurants, they owned the right to torture the women who sat at them. She turned her head slowly to look at Harrison Sterling, who was staring at her with an expression of pure, unadulterated venom. And they believed that the silence of the generation that came before them would continue forever. But they failed to account for a fundamental law of physics: when you apply too much pressure to a structure of high integrity, it doesn't just crush, it pushes back. Clara stood up from her seat at the defense table. She wasn't wearing the long sleeves of her isolation anymore. She wore a sharp, short-sleeved ivory tailoring line that left her bruised wrists completely visible to the court, to the cameras, and to her abuser. She walked to the witness stand, her steps firm, her chin held high, looking directly at Vance without a single trace of the cowering fear that had defined her for years. Your Honor, Clara said, her voice clear, resonant, and entirely devoid of hesitation. For 4 years, I allowed myself to become small because I believed that a broken family was a greater failure than a broken spirit. I allowed my husband to convince me that my intelligence was a threat to our stability, and that my silence was the price of my son's future. But that night, inside that restaurant, when I heard my father-in-law applaud the degradation of my life, I realized that the inheritance I was leaving for my son wasn't wealth or prestige. It was a legacy of cowardice. I am here today to reclaim my voice, my child, and my work. I am not a victim seeking protection. I am a mother demanding justice. The silence that followed her statement was absolute. Vance lowered his gaze to the table, unable to meet her eyes, his hands clenching into desperate, trembling fists under the mahogany wood. Harrison Sterling sat perfectly still, his face dark, realizing that the narrative had turned completely, irrevocably out of his control. Judge Thomas looked down at Clara, his expression transforming from traditionalist skepticism into a look of profound, solemn respect. He leaned forward over his bench, his voice echoing through the silent chamber. The court has seen more than enough evidence to make a definitive ruling regarding these emergency motions, the judge stated, his gavel resting lightly in his right hand. The motion by the plaintiff to revoke the protection order is denied with absolute prejudice. The temporary protection order for Madame Clara Lynn and her son, Leo, is hereby extended into a permanent order of protection, valid for the next 10 years. Mr. Vance Sterling is ordered to surrender his passports immediately, to vacate the primary residence within 24 hours, and is restricted from coming within 500 yards of his wife, his child, or the residence of Madame Beatrice Vance. He turned his gaze to Harrison Sterling, his eyes narrowing with a cutting intensity. Furthermore, this court is referring the security footage and the forensics reports directly to the State Attorney General's office for a formal investigation into criminal aggravated assault and corporate witness tampering. This courtroom will not protect predators, regardless of how much capital they manage. The gavel came down with a resounding, thunderous crack that signaled the definitive end of the Sterling dynasty's absolute authority. 3 months after the trial at the county courthouse, the world had completely reconfigured itself. The Sterling hedge fund had suffered a catastrophic institutional collapse. Over 60% of their primary investors had withdrawn their portfolios within 48 hours of the security footage being broadcast on the national news. Vance Sterling was currently awaiting trial on multiple counts of domestic assault and corporate extortion, his days spent moving between meetings with criminal defense attorneys and the cold reality of a pending judicial sentence. Harrison Sterling had resigned from his chairmanship, his legacy reduced to a cautionary tale about the ruinous consequences of unchecked generational arrogance. But inside the crisp, white-walled rooms of the Vanceland Research Center at the State University, the atmosphere was filled with the vibrant, humming energy of renewal. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and the bright summer sun was streaming through the massive glass panels of the laboratory, illuminating the rows of stainless steel equipment, digital microscopes, and molecular models. This was the space that Clara had designed herself, a space built not to lock the world out, but to let the light of discovery in. Clara stood near the main research terminal, wearing a pristine white lab coat over her clothes, her hair pulled back in a practical, confident knot. She was surrounded by a team of 6 young graduate students, her voice carrying that sharp, brilliant clarity that had once made her the top researcher in her field. She was explaining a complex breakthrough in targeted cellular therapy, her hands moving with a fluid, precise confidence, her bruised wrists now completely healed, showing nothing but clean, radiant skin. Near the back of the laboratory, next to a large window that looked out over the green campus courtyard, sat a small wooden table. My 4-year-old grandson, Leo, was sitting there, happily building a miniature structure out of colorful, interlocking plastic blocks. He wasn't silent, and he wasn't hidden away with an agency nanny. Every time he successfully placed a block, he would look up and shout, "Look, Grandma! Look at the roof!" I sat beside him, a book of classic literature resting in my lap, my emerald velvet gown replaced by a comfortable cotton shirt and a pair of reading spectacles. I looked from my grandson to my daughter, my heart swelling with a deep, profound sense of peace that I hadn't felt since Arthur passed away. Clara finished her lecture, her students dispersing to their respective stations with looks of deep inspiration. She walked over to our table, sliding her hands into the pockets of her lab coat, a warm, genuine smile radiating from her eyes as she looked down at her son's creation. "It has a very solid foundation, Leo," she said softly, leaning down to press a kiss against his forehead. "The columns are strong. It can withstand a lot of weight." She looked up at me, her eyes meeting mine in a silent, beautiful moment of shared understanding. We didn't need to speak about the obsidian room anymore. We didn't need to look back at the shadows or the silences that had tried to bury us. I reached into my canvas bag, pulled out my grandmother's old silver pocket watch, and placed it gently on the table next to Leo's plastic blocks. I looked at the glass face. It was a trick of the afternoon light, perhaps, or the vibration of the laboratory equipment, but the frozen internal gears seemed to give a tiny, sharp tick forward. "The structure is perfect, Clara," I said, my voice carrying the quiet, eternal strength of a mother who had fought the vultures and won. "The foundation is flush. And the house is finally safe." The transition from a state of total, militarized survival back into the quiet rhythms of an ordinary life is not a sudden door closing. It is a slow, methodical recalibration of the senses. 4 months after the gavel fell in Judge Thomas's courtroom, my ears remained unnaturally tuned to the sharp, sudden sounds of the city. A car door slamming on the street outside the brownstone, the heavy tread of a courier's boot on the stone steps, the unexpected vibration of a telephone, each small, mundane event would cause a microscopic tightening in my chest, a brief, instinctive mobilization of defenses. But time, when allowed to flow without the artificial blockages of fear and secrecy, possesses an immense, hydraulic power to smooth the roughest edges of memory. By the autumn of 2026, the public frenzy that had surrounded the collapse of the Sterling dynasty had dried up, replaced by the relentless, fast-moving current of the modern news cycle. The high-definition video of the Obsidian Room, which had once been analyzed frame by frame on national broadcasts, was now buried deep within digital archives, a legal precedent studied in law school seminars rather than a piece of tabloid scandal. The world had moved on, as it always does, leaving us behind in the quiet, solid reality we had fought to construct. It was a crisp, clear late October morning when the true finality of our victory settled into the bricks of the historic district. The ancient oak trees lining our street had turned a vibrant, high-saturation palette of burnt orange and deep amber, their leaves scattering across the wet pavement like fragments of a stained glass window. The air carried the sharp, cheerful scent of wood smoke and damp earth, the exact sensory profile of the season Clara had always preferred, the time of year when the world strips away its superficial green vanity and reveals its underlying structural design. Inside the brownstone kitchen, the Tiffany lamp cast a warm, golden glow across the oak table, where 3 generations of our family were now gathered for breakfast. There was no rush, no frantic checking of devices, no lingering shadow of an impending emotional storm. Leo sat in a booster chair, his face smudged with blueberry jam, his small hands working with intense focus as he tried to construct a bridge out of his morning toast. He had grown nearly 2 inches over the summer, his limbs lengthening, his cheeks losing their pale, institutional hollows and filling out with the bright, healthy flush of a child who knew, with absolute certainty, that the walls around him were safe. "Grandma," he mumbled around a mouthful of crust, pointing a jam-coated finger toward the window. "The big leaves are falling down. Can we go to the park and kick them after school?" "We can kick every single one of them, Leo," I replied, leaning over to wipe a streak of purple from his chin with a damp napkin. "And we will collect the brightest ones to press inside the heavy encyclopedia in the library. Just like your mother used to do." Clara sat across from him, sipping her vanilla tea from an old, chipped ceramic mug that had survived 40 years of domestic history. She wore a thick, dark blue hoodie, her hair loose and falling naturally around her shoulders, completely devoid of the severe, high society styling that Vance had once mandated. Her face was clean, her expression relaxed, her eyes bright with a sharp, calculating intelligence that was no longer forced to hide behind a mask of compliance. She looked down at her wrist, where a simple, minimalist watch sat against her skin. The purple finger marks of the previous spring were entirely gone, replaced by the faint, healthy tan lines of a summer spent outdoors. There were no scars, only the deep, internal knowledge of what those wrists had endured and what they were now capable of holding. Julian called me this morning from the network station, Clara said, her voice carrying a light, easy cadence that I hadn't heard since her undergraduate days. The state attorney general's office has finalized the plea agreement with Vance's criminal defense team. He pleaded guilty to 2 counts of felony domestic assault and 1 count of corporate coercion. There won't be a second public trial. He's been sentenced to 4 years at the minimum security facility upstate, with an absolute restriction on any form of communication or appeal regarding the custody arrangements. I placed my teacup down on its saucer, the porcelain clicking softly in the quiet kitchen. And Harrison? Harrison has completely retired to their estate in Boca Raton, Clara replied, a faint, clinical smile touching the corners of her lips. The regulatory boards finished their compliance audit of the hedge fund last week. They levied a $30 million fine for structural fraud and permanently revoked his trading license. The Sterling name is no longer an asset in this city, Mom. It's a liability. The partners are already rebranding the firm under a completely different corporate title. She reached across the table, her hand covering mine, her grip warm, firm, and filled with an unshakable vitality. It's over. The legal walls are completely built. They can't reach us anymore. I looked down at our joined hands, feeling the steady, rhythmic pulse of her wrist against my palm. For 30 years, I had taught my university students that the defining characteristic of a classical tragedy was the inevitability of ruin, the idea that once a structural flaw was introduced into a family dynamic, it would inevitably expand until the entire house collapsed upon its inhabitants. But as I looked at my daughter and grandson in the warm light of my own kitchen, I realized that classical literature had missed a fundamental truth about human resilience. Ruin is only inevitable if you remain within the architecture of the monster. If you have the courage to step outside the frame, to break the silence, and to build a completely new foundation based on truth and integrity, the tragedy dissolves, leaving behind nothing but the raw material for a beautiful, long-form renewal. At 10 a.m., Clara and I walked through the campus courtyard toward the Vanceland Research Center. The university grounds were bustling with the vibrant, chaotic energy of the autumn semester, young students in bright jackets rushing between lecture halls, the sound of laughter echoing against the limestone facades, the crisp breeze rustling through the canopy of the ancient maples. When we reached the entrance of the research building, I paused for a moment to look at the bronze plaque mounted next to the heavy glass doors. It read, the Vanceland Center for Structural Biochemistry. Dedicated to the pursuit of truth through empirical discovery. The inclusion of my late husband's name, Arthur, alongside Clara's new independent professional title was a deliberate choice. It was a statement of lineage, not a lineage of wealth, coercion, or inherited arrogance like the Sterling line, but a lineage of intellect, curiosity, and moral consistency. We stepped inside, the automatic doors sliding closed behind us, sealing out the damp chill of the autumn morning. The interior of the center was a masterpiece of modern, minimalist architecture, soaring concrete pillars, white-walled corridors, and massive panels of clear glass that allowed every room to be flooded with the bright, cheerful lighting of the natural world. There were no hidden corners here, no dark, mahogany-lined boardrooms where decisions could be made in secret. Everything was open, transparent, and built to facilitate the collective advancement of human knowledge. As Clara slipped into her white lab coat, her primary content avatar within this space became fully realized. She was no longer the isolated, vulnerable woman trapped within the high-end boutiques of the financial district. She was the principal investigator, the director of a multi-million-dollar state research grant, and the mentor to a generation of brilliant young minds. Her graduate students were already at their stations, the laboratory humming with the clean, rhythmic sounds of scientific progress, the gentle whir of centrifuges, the periodic click of automated pipettes, and the low, steady hum of the main supercomputing terminal analyzing molecular configurations. "Good morning, Dr. Lin," a young doctoral student named Maya said, stepping forward with a digital tablet in her hand. The third-phase simulation for the targeted cellular delivery model finished processing at midnight. "The data looks incredible." The structural integrity of the cellular membrane remained completely stable under maximum chemical pressure. The delivery mechanism didn't rupture. Clara took the tablet, her eyes scanning the complex graphs and high-saturation, vibrant color palettes of the molecular models displaying on the screen. The thick, comic-style line work of the digital renderings showed the exact moment of chemical interaction, a clean, perfect union of molecules achieving a stable equilibrium without causing damage to the surrounding system. "This is it, Maya," Clara said, her voice dropping into that deep, reverent tone that always accompanied a major scientific realization. "The model is completely sound. When you choose the right anchoring agent, the structure can withstand any level of external stress. It doesn't break down, it adapts." I watched her from the viewing platform near the back of the lab, leaning against the stainless steel railing. For the past 3 months, my role had shifted from an active combatant in her legal war back to my natural state, an observer, a chronicler, and a source of foundational support. I spent my days reading in the campus library, writing essays on comparative literature, and walking Leo to his early childhood development center. The administrative battles were won, the educational phase had begun. As Clara continued to guide her students through the new dataset, the door to the viewing gallery opened softly, and Elena Vanskovac stepped into the room. She was carrying a thin leather folder, her sharp, minimalist navy suit replaced by a softer, casual tweed blazer appropriate for a campus visit. "I thought I might find you here, Beatrice," Elena said, walking over to join me at the railing, her eyes tracking Clara's movements below. "The university chancellor just signed the final endowment papers. The Sterling Estates mandatory corporate divestment has been fully processed. The court-ordered financial restitution has been directly transferred into the center's permanent operating fund. Clara now has enough independent funding to secure this laboratory for the next 15 years without ever having to solicit a single private donor. It is a poetic piece of structural engineering, isn't it?" I murmured, looking down at the brilliant light reflecting off the stainless steel equipment. The very wealth that was used as a tool to isolate her has now been systematically dismantled to guarantee her absolute professional independence. "Justice is rarely that clean, Beatrice," Elena noted, a quiet smile touching her eyes. "But when you have an investigative reporter like Julian managing the public narrative, a legal team that refuses to negotiate in the dark, and a matriarch who knows exactly where the structural flaws are located, the outcome becomes a matter of logic rather than luck." She handed me the thin folder. "These are the certified copies of the final corporate dissolution documents for the Sterling Charitable Foundation. They are legally non-existent now. The name has been completely erased from the municipal registry." I took the folder, feeling the light weight of the paper in my hands. "Thank you, Elena. For everything. You didn't just manage a lawsuit, you helped us reclaim our family timeline." "Clara did the hard work, Beatrice," Elena said softly, looking down at the laboratory floor where Clara was now laughing warmly at a joke made by one of her students. "She was the one who had to stand up in that witness box and look her monster in the eye. We just held the light so she could see where to strike." By 5 p.m., the laboratory began to quiet down. The graduate students completed their evening storage protocols, shutting down the secondary monitors and heading out into the cool autumn twilight. The bright, cheerful lighting of the facility softened as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, elegant shadows across the polished white floors. Clara walked up the steps to the viewing platform, her lab coat hung neatly near the entrance terminal. She looked tired, but it was a healthy, productive exhaustion, the fatigue of a woman who had spent her day building something real, rather than trying to survive an emotional minefield. "Are you ready to go home, Mom?" she asked, reaching into her pocket to pull out her car keys, her own keys, attached to a simple silver ring that didn't belong to anyone else. "I am ready, Clara," I replied, standing up from my chair and picking up my canvas tote bag. "Leo is waiting for us at the brownstone with my nephew. Julian promised to show him how the television cameras work this evening, and I suspect they are currently turning my living room into a temporary broadcast studio." Clara laughed, a sound that was rich, full, and completely unburdened. "We better get there before they start rearranging the furniture." We walked out of the research center together, our footsteps echoing in the empty, modern corridor. As we stepped through the main entrance doors, the cool evening air hit our faces, carrying the sharp, clean scent of the approaching winter. The sky above the campus was a deep, high-saturation violet, the first stars beginning to pierce through the twilight like tiny, brilliant diamonds scattered across a velvet cloth. We walked down the concrete steps toward the parking lot, our movements synchronized, our heads held high against the evening breeze. As we reached the car, I stopped for a moment, my hand resting on the smooth metal of the door handle. I reached into my bag and pulled out my grandmother's old silver pocket watch. The piece had sat on my dresser for months, an antique relic of a time when our family's history had felt frozen, trapped in a cycle of generational compliance and unvoiced trauma. I held the watch up to the pale light of the campus street lamps. The glass face was clear, the silver casing polished and bright. I pressed the small button at the top of the crown. There was no hesitation. There was no sudden resistance within the internal mechanism. With a sharp, distinct click, the internal gears unlocked, and the long, thin second hand began to sweep smoothly across the Roman numerals, its movement steady, rhythmic, and perfectly aligned with the natural progression of the world. The gears were no longer frozen. The structure had recovered its integrity. I smiled, slipping the ticking watch back into my pocket, feeling its gentle, rhythmic vibration against my side like a second heartbeat. "What is it, Mom?" Clara asked, looking back at me from the driver's side of the vehicle, her face illuminated by the soft amber glow of the dashboard lights. "Nothing, my darling," I replied, climbing into the passenger seat and pulling the door closed, sealing us into the warm, familiar safety of our own space. "Just checking the time. It's exactly where it needs to be." The car started with a low, smooth purr, its headlights cutting through the autumn darkness as we pulled out of the university gates and turned onto the avenue leading back to the historic district. The street lamps blurred past the windows in a continuous line of bright, cheerful light, guiding us back to the old brownstone house where the kitchen fire was burning, where my grandson was waiting, and where our family story was finally, beautifully, and completely home. Stories like this remind us that starting over is terrifying, but it is always possible. If you or someone you love is facing a total reset right now, whether from a divorce, a loss, or a financial disaster, you need a plan. Scan the QR code on your screen or click the link below to get the Phoenix Blueprint for just $17. It gives you the exact steps you need to take in the first 48 hours, and a 90-day plan to get your independence back. Thank you for watching.